a garden of redemption. The summer sun hung heavy over Ashwood Estates, an exclusive gated community known for its immaculate lawns, sprawling Mediterranean-style villas, and a reputation for exclusivity that bordered on isolation. It was the sort of place where the hedges were trimmed within a fraction of an inch, and where perfection wasn't just an expectation, it was a way of life. For Elijah Carter, Ashwood Estates was just another job site. At 34, Elijah had spent years building his landscaping business, Carter & Sons, from a one-man operation into a successful enterprise that served some of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the county. His team was small but skilled, and although his company worked on properties worth millions, Elijah was often treated as if he was part of the scenery, there but unnoticed. Or worse, noticed only when something went wrong. On this particular afternoon, the humidity was oppressive. Elijah moved with practiced efficiency as he sculpted a row of boxwoods outside the Sutherland residence, pausing occasionally to wipe the sweat from his brow. His foreman, Javier, was across the street working on an elaborate water feature, while his apprentice, Malcolm, was busy pruning a wisteria at the next property over. Elijah handled the Sutherland account himself. Mrs. Sutherland was one of the few residents who treated him like a human being. She sometimes brought out lemonade and asked after his family. Small gestures that, in a place like Ashwood, meant a great deal. As he worked, Elijah's eyes drifted to the property next door. The Harringtons had moved in less than a month ago, and already Victoria Harrington had made her presence known. Elijah had heard the whispers among the staff. She was difficult, demanding, and openly dismissive of anyone she considered beneath her. Elijah had offered his business card when they moved in. Victoria had declined with a cold smile, informing him that she already had a landscaping company. He had resisted the urge to point out the poorly maintained sod and the struggling hydrangeas. It wasn't his place. Today, Victoria stood on her back patio, phone in hand, speaking animatedly to someone on the other end of the line. She wore oversized sunglasses and a flowing white linen dress that probably cost more than Elijah's truck. Her 4-year-old son, Lucas, trailed behind her, a tablet clutched in his small hands as he meandered along the edge of the pool. "I told the board," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying over the neatly clipped hedges. "If we let just anyone in, we're no better than Briarwood. That place has gone downhill ever since they started that diversity push." Elijah clenched his jaw, keeping his focus on his clippers. He'd heard this sort of thing before. He'd learned to ignore it. But something about the way she said just anyone made his stomach twist. "Lucas, stay close," Victoria called over her shoulder, not bothering to look at her son. The boy was inching closer to the infinity pool that overlooked the rolling hills beyond the estate. The water shimmered in the sunlight, inviting and deceptively serene. Elijah watched as Lucas's tablet slipped from his hands and skidded toward the pool's edge. Without thinking, the boy lunged after it. Elijah's heart seized. He dropped his shears. "Ma'am," he called, his voice cutting through the air like a warning siren. "Your son." Victoria turned, her expression darkening at the interruption. "Excuse me? I didn't give you permission to." Lucas's small body tumbled into the water with a muted splash. Elijah was moving before she finished her sentence. He vaulted the low hedge separating the properties, his boots pounding across the stone patio. Victoria's voice rose in panic behind him, but Elijah didn't hesitate. He stripped off his boots mid-stride and dove fully clothed into the water. The pool was deep, deeper than he expected. Lucas had already sunk beneath the surface, his limbs flailing weakly. Elijah's strong arms sliced through the water, and within moments, he had the boy in his grasp. "You're okay," Elijah murmured as he surfaced, holding Lucas above the water. "I've got you." Lucas sputtered, coughing up chlorinated water as Elijah swam them both to the pool's edge. He hoisted the boy onto the stone deck with practiced care, checking his breathing as he did. Victoria was there in an instant, yanking Lucas away from Elijah's grasp with a force that made the boy yelp. "What did you do to him?" she demanded, her voice high and shrill. "What did you do?" Elijah stood slowly, his hands open and visible. "He fell," he said calmly. "I pulled him out before he drowned." Victoria's eyes darted between her son and Elijah. Her expression twisted into something Elijah had seen before: fear, mistrust, and something else he'd long since stopped trying to name. "I'm calling the police," she spat, snatching up her phone from the patio table. You assaulted my son. You attacked him. Help. Security. Elijah raised his hands higher, fighting to keep his breathing steady. Ma'am, he said quietly, I just saved your son's life. But she wasn't listening. She was already shouting into the phone. There's an intruder, Victoria cried. A man, black, large, he grabbed my son. He's still here. Please hurry. Elijah felt the weight of the moment settle on him like wet cement. He'd been here before. Not here, exactly, but in situations like this. Misunderstood, mistrusted, and all it took was one person's fear to turn the truth into a distant echo. Minutes later, 2 patrol cars arrived, lights flashing. The officers moved quickly, hands on their weapons as they approached. Hands where we can see them, one barked. Elijah obeyed, his hands already in plain sight. Victoria was still holding Lucas, who now seemed more confused than afraid. That's him, she insisted, her voice breaking. He jumped over my wall and grabbed my son. Elijah spoke evenly. I'm Elijah Carter. I own Carter and Sons Landscaping. I was working next door when I saw the boy fall in. I pulled him out. Sergeant Dean, the ranking officer, eyed Elijah warily. Do you have ID? In my pocket, Elijah said. May I? The sergeant nodded cautiously. Elijah moved slowly, withdrawing his wallet and handing over his driver's license, which was now damp and battered. Dean studied the ID, then Elijah. You live in Millstone. I do, Elijah confirmed. My business serves this area. Mrs. Sutherland can vouch for me. She's right next door. One of the other officers, a younger man with sharp eyes, looked thoughtful. Carter and Sons, he said. Didn't you do that vertical garden at City Hall last year? Elijah nodded. We did. Dean's stance eased slightly. We'll need to review security footage, he said. Ma'am, where are your cameras? Victoria faltered. Inside. The monitor is inside. Dean gestured for one of his officers to follow her. Check the footage, he ordered. Elijah stood in silence, the seconds dragging into long minutes. Across the yard, Mrs. Sutherland appeared at her gate, concern etched on her face. Elijah, she called. What's going on? It's okay, Mrs. Sutherland, Elijah replied, though he wasn't sure it was true. 15 agonizing minutes later, Dean returned. His expression was different now, apologetic, almost respectful. Mr. Carter, he said, you're free to go? The footage confirms your account. You saved the boy. Victoria stood nearby, pale and silent. She wouldn't meet Elijah's eyes. Dean turned to her. Ma'am, your son was unattended near an unsecured pool. Mr. Carter likely saved his life. Victoria's lips moved, but no sound came out. Elijah nodded to Dean. If you're finished with me, I'd like to get back to work. Dean hesitated. For what it's worth, you handled yourself well. Elijah said nothing as he retrieved his boots. In the days that followed, word spread through Ashwood Estates. Some whispered with shame about what Victoria had done. Others tried to rationalize her behavior. But something changed. Victoria appeared at his truck 2 weeks later. She was holding a check and an apology. I was wrong, she said. About you. About everything. Elijah took the check without a word. It was made out to his scholarship fund for underprivileged students pursuing environmental sciences. I'm also interested in switching landscaping services, she added. If you're willing. Elijah considered her for a long moment. I'll think about it. Over the next months, Ashwood Estates began to shift. Victoria became a vocal supporter of Elijah's scholarship fund. Other residents followed her lead. Mrs. Sutherland hosted an event on Elijah's behalf. And Lucas? Lucas spent his afternoons trailing Elijah's crew, asking endless questions about soil, sunlight, and seeds. A year later, Elijah stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new community garden. Victoria stood beside him, Lucas on her hip. This garden, Elijah said to the gathered crowd, isn't just about plants. It's about growth. About seeing beyond what's on the surface. About nurturing something better. The crowd applauded. And for the first time in Ashwood Estates, Elijah Carter wasn't just seen. He was celebrated.